They slept safely that night, warm inside their borders, unaware that the woman they had cast into the rain had just saved every one of their lives. The night they cast her out, the sky was a deep, dark bruise. The wind howled around Starfall Settlement, with clouds pressing low, like the heavens themselves leaned in to watch the scene unfold. The torches in the great courtyard flickered as the wind tried to snuff them out. But they burned, and the pack could see every face in the crowd as if the stars themselves had been replaced by the torches. The people of Starfall had gathered in droves to witness the end of a chapter, the expulsion of someone they could no longer accept. Norah stood in the center of the courtyard, a woman alone, unprotected, and abandoned. She would not give them the satisfaction of folding her hands, of looking for comfort in her own embrace. She would not allow them to see the hurt that surged beneath her chest. She would not allow them the pleasure of knowing how much they had wounded her. Welcome to Floxy's Shifter Romance Tales, where fate bites deep, love burns wild, and powerful beings fall for the one they were never meant to touch. Before we continue, take a second to support the channel. Tap the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts. Now get comfortable, put on your headphones, and let's continue. Alpha Jacob stood above them, his expression one of calculated finality. He was not a cruel man, nor a harsh leader, but a man whose decisions were steeped in what he believed was best for his pack. And right now, Norah was a liability. She had served them, bled for them, healed them when they were injured, but now she was considered useless. You were brought to us, an outsider, and we gave you everything we could. Alpha Jacob's voice echoed across the courtyard, chilling Norah to her very core. And yet, despite everything we've given you, you have failed us. You bear no wolf. You carry no blood ties to this pack. You are a liability we can no longer afford. The words fell heavy on Norah's chest. A liability. That's all she was to them, a burden. She could feel the gaze of the pack upon her, the familiar coldness from the years of living in their shadows, and the weight of their unspoken judgments. She looked around for a familiar face, someone who might stand by her. But Olivia, her closest friend, stood across the courtyard, avoiding her gaze, her face set in an expression Norah had long since learned to recognize: guilt. Her best friend was silent, choosing to be a passive observer instead of defending her. Jonah, however, was not so passive. He pushed forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is wrong," he called, his anger evident. "She has healed each and every one of you. She has bled for this pack and asked for nothing in return." Alpha Jacob's tone was sharp. "Enough, Jonah. This decision is final." Jonah's jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides as he stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes never leaving Norah's face. They locked eyes for a brief moment, and Norah could see it, the love, the understanding, the frustration. He was ready to speak out, to change everything. But she shook her head slightly, silently urging him to stay silent. "Don't," she whispered under her breath. "It won't change anything. And it will cost you everything." Jonah's face contorted with frustration, but he understood. He stepped back, letting Norah take the lead in this painful moment. Turning back to the Alpha, Norah spoke softly, the only word she could manage. "All right." Norah walked away from the courtyard, her feet heavy against the damp earth as she made her way to Isolde's cabin. Her heart was heavy, weighed down by years of loneliness, of rejection. The very people she had healed, the ones she had poured every ounce of herself into, had now thrown her away. She opened the door to the cabin and paused. The familiar warmth of the hearth greeted her, but it was a cold comfort now. Everything she had known here was slipping away, just as the pack had slipped away from her all those years ago. Isolde had been the only one who had ever truly understood her. The only one who had given her a home, a family. And now, with her mother figure gone, Norah was alone in a world that never truly accepted her. She packed her satchel quietly, taking the herb journals, Isolde's teachings, and the small wooden fox that had been given to her on her 20th birthday. Isolde had found her in the woods, abandoned and alone, and had raised her with love, teaching her how to survive in a world that wasn't hers. As Norah packed, memories of her years with Isolde flooded her mind, the way Isolde had cared for her, the way she had never asked for anything in return. And now, Norah was left to carry that legacy, alone. Norah stepped out into the rain, her satchel on her back, and looked back at the cabin. She wouldn't allow herself to mourn it. She had done her grieving long before, back when Isolde had passed. The pack had chosen to forget her, to cast her aside. But they didn't know, nor could they ever know, that it was Norah who had kept them safe. It was Norah who had protected them from the dangers that lurked just outside their borders. And now, as the pack slumbered, unaware, Norah would take her final steps into a world that was waiting to swallow her whole. The rain came down harder now, soaking her through in moments. Norah didn't care. She had lived through far worse than rain. As she walked deeper into the forest, the sound of the wind howling through the trees and the wet leaves crunching beneath her boots were the only things that kept her grounded. The weight in her chest felt as if it would crush her, but she carried it anyway. There was no other choice. The forest had always been her sanctuary. From the very first moment Isolde had found her, abandoned in the woods, Norah had known the trees would always be her home. The tall, ancient oaks, the scent of moss and wet earth, the stillness of it, this was where she felt connected. This was where she could breathe. Here, there was no judgment, no rejection. The forest didn't ask her to be something she wasn't. As Norah walked further, her thoughts drifted back to the night before, to the look in Jonah's eyes as he tried to speak for her. Jonah had always been different from the others. He didn't care that she wasn't part of the pack. He didn't care that she had no blood ties to them. Jonah had always seen her for what she was, a healer, a protector, a woman who had lived her entire life in the shadows of others, doing everything she could to ensure their survival. And yet, he hadn't known the full truth. He hadn't known how much she had done for them, or how much she had sacrificed. Norah reached a familiar clearing, where the forest seemed to open up to her like an old friend, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. She stood there for a moment, letting the rain wash over her, closing her eyes as she listened to the sounds of the forest around her. The rustling of the leaves, the calls of distant animals, everything was so alive. Everything was still breathing. The ache in her chest was unbearable now. She had spent years building barriers for the pack, keeping them safe from the threats they didn't even know existed. But the pack had never known the truth. They never realized that the reason they had survived so many attacks, so many dark forces that had moved through the land, was because of her. Norah had given everything, her strength, her energy, her health, to protect them, even when they had turned their backs on her. She had made herself a weapon, a shield for a pack that had never truly cared for her. She reached the edge of the forest, where the trees parted, revealing the outskirts of the settlement. She paused for a moment, watching the low, steady glow of the torches flicker in the distance. The pack had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that Norah, the woman they had cast out, had been their last line of defense. But the truth was, she had known this moment would come. She had known she would be cast aside eventually. She had always known the pack would never truly accept her. But she hadn't known just how much she would lose when that time came. Norah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of rain and earth. Her pulse was steady, though she could feel the exhaustion creeping in. The last barrier she had built had drained her, taken everything she had left. It wasn't enough. She wasn't enough. Jonah, she whispered to herself, her voice breaking with the weight of his name. She had seen him struggle to make a stand for her. She had seen him push forward through the crowd, fighting to be heard, to speak the truth for her. But she had stopped him. She had shaken her head and told him not to. Because deep down, Norah knew that nothing would change. They had made their decision. The pack had decided she was a liability, and there was nothing she could do to change their minds. As she looked toward the settlement, she felt a strange sense of finality. The people inside those borders were no longer her responsibility. The walls she had built to protect them were now beyond her reach, but they would stand as long as the barrier she had made held. She had given them everything, her strength, her life, her gift. But in the end, it had never been enough. Norah shook her head, brushing the wet strands of hair from her face. The feeling of defeat was overwhelming, but beneath it, something else stirred. Anger, perhaps. Or perhaps something even deeper. A quiet resolve. She had lived her life for them, but now, for the first time, Norah had to live for herself. With that thought, she turned her back on the settlement and started walking. Her feet moved steadily, the rain soaking through her clothes, but her mind was clear. She would not let herself be consumed by the past, by the pack's rejection. Norah had learned long ago that she couldn't change what others thought of her, but she could change what she thought of herself. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the quiet forest, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her loneliness shift into something lighter. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for sure: she would no longer be a shadow in someone else's life. She would carve her own path from here on out. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of rain that soaked through the skin and chilled you to the bone. Norah walked on, her boots sinking into the wet earth with each step. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't have a destination, nor did she care. The only thing she knew was that she couldn't go back to Starfall. Starfall had never been her home. Not really. She had tried to make it so, tried to find some shred of belonging in a place that had never seen her for who she truly was. The pack had accepted her only because Isolde had demanded it, Isolde, the healer who had found her in the woods all those years ago. But the truth was, Norah had never been a part of them. She had always been an outsider, a healer with no wolf blood, no pack bond. They had tolerated her, used her, but they had never accepted her. Now, standing at the edge of the forest, the cool rain washing over her, Norah felt the weight of the years press down on her. The years spent serving a pack that had never truly seen her. The years spent healing, patching up wounds, curing sickness, doing everything she could to make them better, while they had turned their backs on her time and time again. But that was over now. She couldn't fix them anymore. They had made their choice. They had cast her out, and in doing so, they had sentenced themselves. Norah had done everything she could to protect them from the darkness that loomed just outside their borders, but now, that darkness was coming, and there was no one left to stop it. She pulled the satchel tighter against her back, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the carved wooden fox Isolde had given her on her 20th birthday. It was the only piece of Isolde she had left, the only connection to the woman who had raised her, loved her, and taught her everything she knew. Norah had never asked Isolde who her real mother was, or why Isolde had taken her in. She had never asked why Isolde had cared for her when no one else would. It didn't matter. Isolde had given her a purpose, had given her a place in a world that had never wanted her. And now, with Isolde gone, Norah had nothing left. But she would not let herself wallow in grief. She wouldn't let herself be consumed by the past any longer. The pack had thrown her out, but that wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something she had never imagined. For the first time in her life, she was free. Free from the expectations of the pack. Free from their judgments. Free to carve her own path. The forest was her only companion now, the towering trees standing like silent sentinels around her. Norah walked deeper into the woods, letting the rain soak her through. She could feel the presence of the forest surrounding her, the energy of the earth beneath her feet, the hum of life in the trees. She had always felt connected to this place, always felt a sense of peace when she was in the woods. As she walked, her mind began to wander. She thought of Jonah, the warrior who had always stood by her side, even when no one else would. Jonah, who had tried to speak for her, who had risked his position in the pack to defend her. He had always seen her, even when no one else did. But it wasn't enough. He hadn't been able to change the outcome. The pack had made their decision, and Jonah had been silenced by Alpha Jacob's command. She had told him to stay quiet, to let it go. But now, as she walked alone in the woods, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Jonah had cared for her, had been there for her in ways no one else had. He had been her anchor, the only person who had truly understood her. But now, he was back in the settlement, living with the aftermath of a decision that had torn them apart. Norah didn't know if she would ever see him again. But she couldn't let that hold her back. She couldn't dwell on the past. She had to focus on the present, on the path ahead of her. The night was falling, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. Norah didn't want to camp. She didn't want to stop moving. Her legs ached, her feet were sore, but she pushed forward. There was something waiting for her, something she had to find. The storm that had raged over Starfall had not been the only storm brewing. There was a darkness, a force that was spreading, and it was coming for everyone. Norah could feel it in her bones. It had started as a whisper, a feeling she couldn't explain, a pressure in the air that weighed down on her. But now, it was more than that. She could see it in the way the wind had shifted, the way the trees seemed to bow beneath an unseen force. The darkness was moving closer. She quickened her pace, pushing through the thick brush, her breath coming in sharp bursts. She had to find the source of this force, had to understand what it was before it consumed everything in its path. As she moved deeper into the forest, a sharp pain shot through her hands, as though 1,000 tiny needles were stabbing into her skin. Her fingers clenched, and she gasped in pain. The burn that had been simmering inside her for years was now rising to the surface. The power that had awakened in her body all those years ago was pushing forward, demanding attention. She staggered, clutching her satchel as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She could feel the power surging through her veins, hotter now, more insistent. It had always been a part of her, but she had kept it contained, had kept it buried deep inside. She had learned to control it, to suppress it, but now it was breaking free. Norah stopped, breathing heavily, her heart racing. She had to keep moving. She couldn't let the power consume her again. She had learned the hard way how dangerous it could be when she let it take control. The cost was always too high. She pushed on, her mind focused on the path ahead. She would not let herself be overwhelmed. She would not let the power destroy her. She had to find a way to stop the darkness, to protect the people she had failed to protect before. But the forest had grown eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, and the wind had died down. It was as though the world had gone still, holding its breath. Norah glanced around, her senses heightened. There was something here, something watching her from the shadows. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind a tree, blocking her path. Norah froze, her heart skipping a beat. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face she recognized instantly. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Jonah stood before her, his eyes locked on hers with a mixture of concern and something deeper, something Norah couldn't name. He looked tired, his face drawn, his clothes soaked through. But he was here. He had found her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of relief and confusion. Jonah stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "I couldn't let you go," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I couldn't leave you out here alone. Not after everything." "You think I could just let you walk away like that?" Norah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had never expected him to follow her, never expected him to come after her. But here he was, standing in front of her, his presence grounding her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have stayed behind. You have a place in the pack. You—" "I don't care about the pack," Jonah interrupted, his voice firm, yet gentle. "I care about you. And that's all that matters. I don't care if you're not one of them. I don't care that you're not Wolf. You're still my family." Tears welled up in Norah's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She couldn't let herself fall apart now. She couldn't afford to be weak. But Jonah was standing here, in front of her, and she felt like the world had shifted once again. "I've never had a family," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know what to do with this. I've been alone my whole life." Jonah reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Norah looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope stir within her. It was fragile, but it was there. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah smiled, his eyes softening. "Don't thank me. I'm just trying to make up for all the time I wasted not telling you what I should have told you a long time ago." Norah's heart raced. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to process everything that was happening. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Jonah was here. And for the first time in her life, Norah felt like she was finally seen. Finally understood. Jonah's presence grounded her in a way Norah hadn't expected. Standing in the rain-soaked forest, surrounded by the quiet shadows of the trees, Norah felt the weight of the world shift. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to see her until Jonah stepped forward, that one person who had always been there in the quietest of ways. His quiet resolve, his loyalty, had always been present, but now it felt like an anchor, steadying her in the midst of the storm. He reached out slowly, as if hesitant to close the distance between them, but his hand found hers with a firm, reassuring grip. "I don't want you to be alone," Jonah said, his voice soft but filled with something raw, something that spoke to a depth of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to show until now. "I can't just let you walk away into the unknown, not without me." Norah's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, to tell him that he shouldn't be here, that he needed to be with his pack, that he was making a mistake by following her. But the words didn't come. She was too tired, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the last few hours, the last few years. And in that moment, she didn't want to push him away. She wanted the comfort, the reassurance, the shared presence of someone who knew her, someone who had seen the parts of her no one else had dared to look at. For a long time, she had carried the weight of being alone. It had become so much a part of her existence that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone care. But now, Jonah was here. Jonah, with all his strength and kindness, his unwavering loyalty, was standing beside her. And for the first time in years, Norah let herself take a breath without the constant weight of solitude pressing down on her. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the wind, "I don't know what this is anymore. I don't know who I am without that pack. I don't know how to exist without their judgment, their rules. They've shaped me in ways I didn't even realize until they pushed me out." Jonah squeezed her hand, gently pulling her toward him, his face earnest and calm, though his eyes were filled with unspoken emotions. "You don't have to be shaped by them anymore," he said softly. "You've been living under their weight for too long. Now, you can make your own path. I'm here to walk it with you." The silence stretched between them for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something freeing in Jonah's words. For once, she didn't feel the need to explain herself, to justify her actions, to make excuses for who she was. Jonah accepted her, perhaps in a way no one else ever had. The thought sent a surge of warmth through her chest. She could feel it, slowly creeping through her veins, chasing away the chill of the rain. He was here. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. Norah shook her head, as if trying to shake off the remnants of the past. "What now?" she asked quietly. "Where do we go from here?" Jonah looked around, the weight of the moment settling between them. "I don't know. But I do know this. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens next, we face it together. You've carried this burden for so long. It's time to let someone else carry it with you." She met his gaze, and in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. It was as though all the years of tension, of pain, of unvoiced longing, finally came to a head. They didn't need to say more. They didn't need to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that they were together, facing the unknown with the kind of strength that came from solidarity, from knowing that someone truly had your back. The storm had stopped, but the air still held a certain weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Norah looked around, her gaze sweeping over the trees, the distant settlement barely visible through the thickening fog. Everything felt different now. The world had shifted, and with it, her sense of what was possible. Jonah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Come on. Let's find shelter for the night." Norah nodded, grateful for the simplicity of his suggestion. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, though it was filled with something new, hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. They walked side by side, the rain still dripping from the trees above them, the forest quiet but alive around them. Norah had always felt a sense of connection to the forest, but now, in this moment, it felt like it was opening up to her in a new way. The weight of her past, the years of rejection and isolation, still clung to her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like it was all she had. Jonah led her to a small clearing not far from the edge of the forest, where a small shelter stood. It was a simple structure, more of a lean-to than a cabin, but it was dry, and it offered them protection from the elements. As they entered, Jonah immediately began gathering firewood, his movements quick and purposeful. Norah watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: gratitude. Jonah's presence was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of her soul. She realized, as she stood there watching him, that the weight of the world didn't feel as heavy with him beside her. They didn't need to talk, to explain everything. They were together, and that was enough. When the fire was lit, they sat across from each other, the warmth from the flames licking at their skin, a quiet peace settling between them. Norah stretched out her legs, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the walls of the shelter. The night was still, and for once, Norah allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, letting the warmth of the fire and the steady sound of Jonah's breathing lull her into a sense of calm. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" Jonah asked, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Norah opened her eyes, meeting his gaze across the fire. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think, for the first time, I'm not so afraid of it." Jonah smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good. Because whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Norah's heart fluttered in her chest. "Together," she repeated softly, the word feeling like the first breath she had taken in a long time. The fire crackled between them, and for a moment, Norah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her after all. Norah woke to the sound of birds singing somewhere in the distance. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft glow over the shelter. The morning air was crisp, cool against her skin, and the soft rustle of leaves outside the shelter hinted at the world waking up around them. She sat up slowly, her body aching with the after-effects of exhaustion. Her muscles were sore, her joints stiff from the long walk the day before. But despite the fatigue, there was something different in her heart today. The weight that had crushed her chest for so long, the constant pressure of isolation, was gone. For the first time in a long time, she felt lighter, freer. She looked over at Jonah, still asleep, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each steady breath. His face was relaxed, unguarded in sleep, and for a moment, Norah found herself staring at him. He had always been a quiet force in her life, there, present when she needed him, steady when the world around her felt like it was crumbling. Now, as she watched him, she realized that something had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about fighting the pack's rejection or trying to find a place where she belonged. It was about this, a connection that had grown, quietly and unexpectedly, between her and Jonah. She shook her head, as if trying to shake off the thought. There were things she needed to focus on, things that had been left unsaid. But Jonah was here, and for the first time, the questions of what she would do next didn't feel so heavy. She stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head, the stiffness in her muscles a reminder of the long journey ahead. There was still so much to do. The darkness was still out there, pressing in on the world. But now, she wasn't alone. She had Jonah by her side, and that gave her more strength than she ever thought she'd have. As the sky outside the shelter began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Norah moved toward the small fire pit they had made the night before. The fire had died down almost completely, leaving only the glowing embers behind. She knelt beside it, feeding small twigs into the pit, her thoughts drifting as she worked. The forest was still, but there was a tension in the air that felt different from the weight of the night. Something was coming. Norah could feel it in her bones, deep inside her. The dark force that had been growing, the one she had been trying to outrun, was drawing nearer. She needed to be ready. Jonah stirred behind her, his voice rough with sleep. "What time is it?" he asked, lifting his head to look at her. Norah glanced over her shoulder, offering him a small smile. "Not sure. But it's early." Jonah yawned, rubbing his face. "I thought I'd sleep longer." "I haven't slept like that in ages." Norah nodded, the quiet comfort of his words settling in her chest. She was used to being alone, to carrying everything on her own, but this felt different. Having Jonah here, sharing this burden, was something she hadn't known she needed. Jonah stood up slowly, stretching his limbs as he made his way over to her. "How are you feeling?" Norah hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She wasn't sure how she felt. The power inside her was still there, stirring in her veins, still pulling at her when she least expected it. She could feel it, pushing at the edges of her awareness. But she didn't want to burden Jonah with the weight of it. I'm okay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. "Just tired." Jonah raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You sure?" Norah offered him a tight smile. "Yeah. I'm just adjusting." Jonah studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, without a word, he walked over to where their supplies were stashed, pulling out some dried meat and fruit. He handed it to her with a quiet nod. "Eat something. We'll need our strength for what's ahead." She took the food gratefully, biting into the dried meat as she thought about what Jonah had said. What's ahead? She didn't know. The truth was, Norah was more uncertain than ever about what lay ahead. There was still so much she didn't understand about the force that was drawing near, and now, with the pack's expulsion behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had a bigger role to play in all of this. She couldn't go back to the pack, but the thought of staying in the woods forever was a strange kind of fear she hadn't been ready for. There was no clear path forward, no easy solution. She had to trust herself, trust Jonah, and hope that they would be strong enough to face whatever was coming. Jonah sat beside her, cracking open a small flask of water and offering it to her. She took a sip before handing it back, her mind racing with all the things she needed to do. She needed to build a barrier, one strong enough to hold whatever was coming. She needed to figure out what this power inside her really was and how to use it without destroying herself. And above all, she needed to understand why she was the one carrying this burden. Norah looked at Jonah, his face now more serious than before. "I think we need to move," she said quietly. "There's something coming, Something we can't ignore. Jonah nodded, his eyes narrowing in thought. I've been feeling it too. The air is heavy with it. I think we should head to the old ruins, the place we talked about. We might find answers there. Norah hesitated. The ruins were far from here, deep in the forest, and getting there would take at least a full day's walk. But there was something about the idea of going there, of searching for answers in the place they had once talked about, that felt like the right decision. All right, Norah agreed, standing up and brushing the dirt from her pants. Let's go. They packed their things quickly, gathering the last of their supplies and securing their shelter. As they walked through the forest, the early morning light filtering through the trees, Norah's mind raced with thoughts of the ruins, of what might await them there. The journey wasn't easy. The forest was dense, and the trail wasn't well marked, but Jonah moved with an ease that came from knowing the woods intimately. Norah followed him closely, her thoughts swirling. She could feel the power building inside her again, pushing against her skin as if it were trying to break free. She didn't know what it was, didn't understand it, but she had learned to accept that it was a part of her now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the trees more twisted and gnarled. The once familiar woods felt different now, darker somehow, as though something had shifted in the very earth beneath them. Norah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they weren't alone in these woods. We're close, Jonah said suddenly, glancing over his shoulder at her. Norah nodded, her pulse quickening. She could sense the change in the air too. The ruins were near. And with them, whatever answers they might find. As they reached the clearing, Norah felt a strange pull in her chest, a quiet ache that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth beneath her. The ruins were more imposing than she remembered. Tall stone structures, broken and overgrown with vines and moss, stood like silent sentinels. This is it, Norah said, her voice barely a whisper. She stepped forward, her feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath her, and felt the pull of the earth grow stronger. Jonah was beside her, his presence a steady anchor as they walked into the heart of the ruins. The air was thick with ancient energy, the weight of history pressing in on them. And for the first time since the pack had thrown her out, Norah felt as though she was exactly where she needed to be. Let's see what we find, Jonah murmured, his voice a low rasp. And with that, they stepped deeper into the ruins, ready to face whatever secrets lay hidden in the shadows. The ruins stretched before Norah, ancient stone pillars standing tall against the test of time. The air grew cooler as they ventured deeper into the forgotten heart of the forest, the thick canopy of trees casting shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. The sounds of the forest faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving only the rustling of their feet on the overgrown path. Every step they took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, making the silence even more oppressive. Norah couldn't shake the feeling that the ruins were watching her, their worn, weathered faces hiding secrets buried deep within the earth. She'd always known there was more to this forest, more to her own existence than she had been told. The power that surged within her, the mysterious force she had carried with her all her life, had to be connected to this place. She could feel it, like an invisible thread pulling her forward. Jonah, walking silently beside her, sensed the same tension in the air. He'd always been the one to remain grounded, the one who took everything in stride. But even he couldn't mask the unease that was growing between them. Stay close, Jonah said, his voice a low murmur as he reached for Norah's arm, guiding her toward a large stone archway that marked the entrance to the inner part of the ruins. The arch, though cracked and broken, was still imposing, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. Norah stepped forward, her boots crunching on the dry earth. She could feel the weight of the stone against her, as though the very ruins themselves were reacting to her presence. The carvings on the arch were worn and faded, but some of them seemed to glow faintly, an eerie, ancient light pulsing within the grooves. Do you see that? Norah whispered, her voice trembling with the realization that the stones were alive, or at least had been once. The carvings weren't random. They told a story, a language she didn't know but felt she understood. Jonah nodded, but his gaze remained wary. I see it. But I don't like this, Norah. Something's not right about this place. Norah didn't answer. She couldn't. Because in the pit of her stomach, she knew Jonah was right. This place, these ruins, were ancient, yes, but they were also dangerous. They had a history, and whatever secrets they held, Norah knew that she was meant to uncover them. The air grew heavier as they passed beneath the arch, and Norah felt the familiar tug of power inside her, stronger now, pressing at her skin like it wanted to break free. She wasn't sure if it was the ruins or her own growing connection to this strange power, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This place, this forgotten structure, was bound to her fate. The deeper they moved into the ruins, the more overwhelming the silence became. Norah's footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of moss and dirt that had claimed the stone floors, the ancient stone pathways barely visible beneath the overgrowth. They came to a large, circular chamber, its high walls lined with faded murals depicting scenes she couldn't fully decipher. She stopped at the center of the chamber, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on her. The murals showed figures, humanoids with features she recognized as both similar and entirely different from the wolves of Starfall. Their faces were elongated, their eyes glowing in the shadows. There were symbols woven between the figures, markings that seemed to pulse and shift, as if alive. Jonah stopped behind her, his eyes scanning the room with caution. "What do you think they mean?" Norah could feel the power that radiated from the murals, like an unseen force pulling her into them. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I feel like I've seen these symbols before. Somewhere, deep in my memories." Jonah stepped closer, his brow furrowed as he traced one of the carvings with his finger. "These markings, they remind me of something ancient. Something old. But I can't put my finger on it. It feels dangerous." Norah nodded but didn't speak. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. But the weight of the truth that loomed around her, the power within her, the history of this place, it was overwhelming. And deep down, she knew that whatever was waiting for them here, whatever secrets these ruins held, were tied to her past, her power, and her future in ways she couldn't yet understand. She moved deeper into the chamber, her hand brushing against the cold stone. It felt alive beneath her touch, as if the walls were breathing with her, resonating with the power inside her. The floor beneath her feet hummed with an energy that vibrated through her body, intensifying the pull of the power that surged within her. Then, she saw it, a large stone pedestal in the center of the room, its surface worn smooth with time. Resting on top was a small, glowing object. Norah's breath caught in her throat. It was a pendant, intricately carved, its surface gleaming with an inner light that seemed to draw her in. "This is it," Norah whispered, her voice a breathless awe. "This is what I've been searching for." Jonah looked at her, concern lining his features. "Norah, wait. Don't touch it. I don't like this. Something about this feels wrong." But Norah didn't hear him. The pendant pulsed in her vision, calling to her, and before she knew it, her hand was reaching for it. The moment her fingers brushed against the cold surface, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A deep rumble filled the air, and Norah staggered back, her heart racing. The pendant flared with light, and the walls of the chamber seemed to vibrate, a low hum resonating in the air. Norah could feel the energy coursing through her, building inside her chest until she thought it might burst. The power inside her surged wildly, but now it felt different, stronger, more ferocious, as though something within her had awakened. "No!" Jonah shouted, his voice full of panic as he reached out for her, but it was too late. The pendant had already sealed its hold on her. The light that radiated from it blinded her, and Norah felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The walls seemed to dissolve around her, and she was falling, tumbling through space, through time, through something she couldn't name. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The world around her returned to stillness. The humming in the air faded, leaving a deathly silence in its wake. Norah blinked, disoriented, as she found herself standing in the middle of the chamber once more. The pendant lay on the pedestal, no longer glowing, no longer pulsing with the same power it had just moments ago. Jonah was standing beside her, his face pale with worry. "Norah, what happened?" His voice was strained, his hands reaching for her, but she pulled away, her mind racing with confusion. "I don't know," she breathed, her chest tight. "It felt like something opened up inside me." Jonah looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Do you feel different? Do you feel like you've—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish the thought. Norah closed her eyes, pressing her palm to her chest. She could feel it, the power inside her, thrumming like a heartbeat. But it was different now. It was no longer a small, contained force. It was vast, it was ancient, and it was pulsing with a power that felt connected to the very earth beneath her feet. "I feel," she struggled to find the words. "I feel like I've been connected to something bigger than myself." Jonah took a step back, his face etched with concern. "What does that mean, Norah? What did you just do?" Before Norah could answer, a distant rumble echoed through the ruins, vibrating the very ground beneath their feet. Jonah's head snapped toward the entrance of the chamber, his eyes narrowing. "What was that?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Norah didn't answer. She could feel it now, an oppressive energy, dark and sinister, approaching from the outside. The force that had been building for so long was here. And now, Norah knew, it was going to test her. She turned to Jonah, her eyes sharp with resolve. "We need to leave. Now." Jonah's gaze locked with hers, and for a moment, they stood there, the weight of everything they had just uncovered pressing down on them. Then, without another word, they turned and fled from the ruins, their footsteps echoing in the silence as they ran toward an unknown future. But they both knew one thing for certain. The storm was coming, and they would have to face it together. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had always been a place of refuge for Norah, a place where she could lose herself in the stillness of nature, where she could let the burdens of her past slip away like the rain running down the trunks of the trees. But now, the very air felt thick with tension, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Every step they took, every snap of a twig beneath their boots, felt like it echoed through the silence. The distant rumble they had heard inside the ruins was no longer a faint memory. It was real, and it was coming closer. Norah moved quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the power inside her, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. It had grown stronger, more insistent, ever since she had touched the pendant. She didn't understand it. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel its weight pressing down on her, wrapping around her like a second skin. The power was no longer just a part of her. It had become a force she couldn't control, a force that had awakened something deep within her. Jonah was a few paces behind her, his face set with determination, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He didn't speak, but Norah could feel the questions swirling around him. He wanted to know what had happened inside the ruins. He wanted to know what had changed, but she didn't have the answers. She wasn't even sure what had happened herself. All she knew was that the world felt different now, heavier, darker, and something was coming for them. Something they couldn't outrun. They reached the edge of the forest, the trees thinning as they came into a small clearing. Norah paused, scanning the horizon, her senses straining for any sign of what was coming. She could feel it, the dark force that had been building, pushing closer, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it found them. Jonah stepped up beside her, his hand brushing against hers in silent support. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though she could hear the edge of fear that he was trying to hide. He had always been strong, but this was different. "I don't know," Norah replied, her voice tight with uncertainty. "But I have to build another barrier. A stronger one. This time, it has to hold." Jonah's gaze sharpened, his eyes flicking to the forest behind them. "What kind of barrier?" "The one you built before. It nearly killed you. Are you sure you're strong enough for this?" "I don't have a choice," Norah said, her voice resolute, though her body felt like it was made of lead. She knew Jonah was right, she was far from fully recovered, and the last barrier had taken everything she had. But if she didn't build one now, if she didn't stop whatever was coming, it would tear through them both. She closed her eyes, her fingers trembling as she reached out toward the earth beneath her. The power inside her surged again, and for a moment, she hesitated. She could feel the energy building in her chest, but it was different now. It wasn't just the force that had always been inside her, it was something ancient, something tied to the land, to the very roots of the earth. She had been warned of this, had been told that the force within her was not something to be tampered with. But what choice did she have? She was the only one who could stop this. Taking a deep breath, Norah placed her hands flat on the ground, her fingers pressing into the soil as she called on the power that flowed through her. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble in response, the earth shifting as if it were alive. The air grew heavy with the energy she was channeling, and Norah's skin prickled with the intensity of it. She could feel the ancient force inside her waking, stretching, reaching for the earth around her. The wind picked up, swirling around her, and the trees seemed to bow under the weight of it. Norah's heart raced as she focused, pushing the power outward, shaping it into a barrier, a wall of energy that would keep whatever was coming at bay. But as she worked, she felt something else, a presence, dark and heavy, closing in on them. It wasn't just the power she had summoned. This was something else, something far more sinister. The darkness that had been creeping toward them had found them. Nora's breath hitched in her chest as the force surged forward, slamming against her barrier. The ground beneath her feet cracked, and the trees around them groaned in protest. The barrier shuddered, and Nora cried out in pain as the strain on her body intensified. She could feel the energy draining from her legs weakening beneath her. "Norah!" Jonah shouted, his voice breaking through the haze of pain and power. "You need to stop. You're pushing yourself too hard." But Norah couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The force was too strong, too close. She had to hold the barrier, had to keep it up long enough for them to escape. The wind howled around them, the sky above them darkening as the energy in the air grew more intense. Nora's vision blurred, the world spinning around her as the power threatened to overwhelm her. She could feel the darkness pressing against the barrier, trying to break through, trying to consume them both. "Jonah, get back!" she cried, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "I can't hold it much longer." But Jonah didn't move. He stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, grounding her as the energy inside her surged. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "You're not doing this alone." Nora's chest tightened with emotion, but she couldn't focus on that now. The barrier was flickering, the energy around them growing unstable. She could feel the cracks forming in it, could sense the dark force pushing through, like a weight too great for even her power to withstand. "Please," Jonah said, his voice soft now, his hand tightening around hers. "Don't push yourself too far." Norah closed her eyes, fighting to keep the barrier intact. She could feel it slipping, could feel the darkness closing in. Her body was screaming for rest, for release, but she couldn't let go. Not yet. Then, just as she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, a new force surged through her. Jonah's presence, his steadying hand on hers, his warmth filling the space between them. It was the connection she had never realized she needed. He was there, a grounding force, a support she had never allowed herself to accept before. Together, they focused on the barrier, their hands joined, their energy united. The force surged forward, pushing against them, but this time, it felt different. It felt like they were stronger together, like the power inside them could hold. The ground trembled, but the barrier held. For a moment, there was silence, the wind dying down, the world holding its breath. Then, the pressure receded. The dark force, the presence that had been bearing down on them, faltered and dissipated, retreating back into the forest, away from them. Norah collapsed to her knees, exhausted, her breath ragged in her chest. Jonah caught her before she hit the ground, pulling her into his arms, holding her steady as she trembled from the exertion. "You did it," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with awe and relief. Norah nodded weakly, her eyes closed as she leaned against him, the weight of what they had just faced sinking into her bones. She had done it. She had held the barrier. But at what cost? The darkness had retreated for now, but Norah knew it wasn't gone. It would come back. It would always come back. And the next time, she wouldn't know if she would be strong enough to stop it. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough. Jonah stayed silent for a long time, his hand resting gently on her back as she caught her breath. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but full of something deeper. "You're not alone, Norah. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. I'll always be here." Norah didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Her body was too exhausted, her mind too clouded with the weight of everything that had just happened. But for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. They had faced the storm. And they had survived. But as Norah closed her eyes, her thoughts already drifting toward what lay ahead, she knew the storm was far from over. Norah woke the next morning to an eerie quiet. The wind had died down, leaving behind the faint smell of wet earth and damp leaves in the cool morning air. The sky above them was clear, the early light soft and golden as it filtered through the trees. The world seemed to be holding its breath, as though waiting for the next chapter to begin. Jonah had insisted they rest the night before, his arms wrapped around her as she had drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. His steady presence beside her had been the anchor she hadn't realized she needed. Now, as she woke, she found herself still nestled in his warmth, her head resting on his chest, his steady heartbeat a constant, reassuring rhythm beneath her ear. For the first time in a long time, Norah felt at peace. The weight of everything, the banishment, the years of rejection, the power inside her, hadn't disappeared. But it was quieter now. She wasn't alone in this. And somehow, that made all the difference. Jonah shifted slightly, his hand brushing against her hair as he woke. "Morning," he murmured softly, his voice rough from sleep. Norah smiled, her lips curving into a small, tired but genuine grin. "Morning," she replied, lifting her head to meet his gaze. He smiled back, his eyes still shadowed with the exhaustion of the past few days, but there was something in his expression, something that told Norah that they had come through something together, something that neither of them would ever forget. "We did it," Norah said quietly, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. "We stopped it." Jonah nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "For now. But we both know it's not over." Norah closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. The battle wasn't won, not by a long shot. The darkness was still out there, still pressing against the world, waiting for its next chance. But for now, they had a moment of peace, and that was something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for in a long time. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the question out loud would make it too real. Jonah sat up, his hands resting on his knees as he looked out over the clearing. The forest around them was still quiet, peaceful even, as if nothing had happened at all. But Norah knew better. They had both felt the darkness, felt it bearing down on them. It was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of the world they could see. He glanced back at her, his expression steady but full of something she couldn't quite read. "We move forward," he said simply. "We take it one day at a time. And we do it together." The words rang through Norah's heart like a bell, clear and true. They hadn't been given a choice in this. None of them had. But they had been given each other, and that, for the first time in her life, felt like enough. "I can't do this alone," she admitted, her voice raw as she looked at him, her eyes filled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: trust. Jonah reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. "You're not alone. Not anymore." Norah didn't respond immediately. She didn't have to. She simply leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, letting the warmth of his presence fill the spaces that had been cold and empty for so long. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "What if I can't keep going? What if the darkness comes back stronger than before?" Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on hers, his thumb gently brushing over her skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm, grounded in something deeper than fear. "We face it. Together. Whatever happens, we face it. We don't let it break us." Norah looked up at him, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite put into words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could withstand whatever was coming, but part of her was still scared. Part of her still wasn't sure she could carry the weight of this power, this responsibility. She wasn't sure she was strong enough. But Jonah was here, and his steady presence was a lifeline. And maybe that was all she needed, for now. She nodded slowly, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Together," she repeated quietly, more to herself than to him. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it felt like a promise, a vow she was making to herself, to Jonah, and to whatever future lay ahead. Jonah squeezed her hand. Together. The day passed in a quiet blur. They spent the morning gathering their things and making sure their camp was secure. Norah moved mechanically, her mind still heavy with the events of the past few days, but something inside her had shifted. The weight of the world hadn't lifted, but the fear that had always accompanied it was now tempered with something else, a strange kind of clarity. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she could face it. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the clearing, Norah and Jonah sat together by the fire. They spoke little, content to simply be in each other's company, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. Norah couldn't help but glance up at Jonah now and then, her gaze lingering on the way the firelight danced across his features. He had always been there for her, always in the background, a constant she hadn't fully appreciated until now. She realized, with a quiet shock, that she had never truly allowed herself to lean on him, not in the way he had leaned on her. But now, in the midst of all this uncertainty, she had to admit that they had become something more than just allies in survival. They had become something real. Something she had never allowed herself to believe in before. They were family. And that was enough. The night passed slowly, and Norah's thoughts began to drift as the fire crackled and popped in front of them. The forest around them had settled into the quiet rhythm of the night. The wind had died down, and the stillness that had settled over the land felt almost peaceful. But in the back of her mind, the nagging feeling of the darkness still loomed. It was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And Norah knew she couldn't let her guard down. The question lingered in the air, what now? Where did they go from here? Norah didn't have the answers, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had Jonah beside her, and that was a force in itself. The world had tried to break her, to push her into a corner, to make her feel like she didn't belong. But it hadn't succeeded. She had stood up, faced the darkness, and pushed back. And now, she was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in her life, Norah felt like she was walking her own path. A path she had made for herself, with the strength and resilience that had always been inside her, waiting to be recognized. The storm was coming. But this time, Norah wouldn't face it alone. And that, she thought, was the beginning of something new.